beginner friendly, flexible, tanky, and great endgame clearing for the pit and nightmare dungeons. That simply sums up the shadow damage over time menace. Welcome to an overview of the Blight Necromancer from the perspective of a fairly inexperienced Diablo 4 player. This build got me to pit tier 50 and nightmare dungeons tier 100 before ever reaching level 100. And considering this was my first real go at Diablo 4's endgame and my first level 100 character, I think that indicates a pretty strong build. Before we get started, there are two prolific variants of this build. The first one being more of an all-rounder which balances damage, survivability, and focuses more on clearing speed of all content, whereas the other one is a very endgame bossing variant that focuses all in on damage and specifically single target damage to quickly take down the harder bosses of high tier pits or level 200 tormented bosses, but in turn sacrifices survivability and clear speed. In this video I will be talking about the first variant since it's more beginner friendly, requiring less min-maxing, and is what I personally play. And one more thing, in the background you may see various clips of my journey to 100 where I drop some of the best in slot items or just come across something cool like the Butcher, and then I will just play a full unedited run of the highest pit tier I can currently do, which I think is somewhere around 60. Right, so this build consists of shooting out multiple blights, which essentially are a shadow version of Fireball, except from the fact that they leave an unholy pool of blight under wherever they land, dealing area of effect shadow damage over time, and slowing enemies by 25% over 6 seconds. You will also deal 20% more damage to blighted enemies. During the leveling phase, you will most likely only shoot one of these blights. However, in the endgame, you will be able to shoot 5 of these at once, thanks to the unique necklace called Ebon Piercer. On top of these blights, you will also be utilising Corpse Explosion to leave even more and much larger blighted pools on the floor, dealing yet more damage over time to surrounding enemies. While leveling, you will have to manually use the ability to explode corpses around you. However, in the endgame, this will automatically be casted every 1 to 2 seconds, utilising the unique ring of the Sacrilegious Soul. A perfect pairing along with Corpse Explosion is Corpse Tendrils, which will also be automatically activated via the same unique ring, ranging from 8 to 16 seconds depending on the role. Corpse Tendrils will pull in surrounding enemies and stun them for 3 seconds, slow them by 50% and make them vulnerable, increasing your damage done and grouping enemies on top of your blighted pools, therefore increasing the speed at which you can clear content as well as increasing your survivability considering they get stunned for 3 seconds. Talking about survivability, you will constantly be using the Curse of Decrepify to slow all cursed enemies by 40% and reduce the damage they deal to you by 20%, which in the hardest content available is a massive damage reduction. Along with a lucky hit, which this build scales a lot of, enemies affected by Decrepify will also have up to a 10% chance to be stunned by your abilities for 2 seconds and up to a 15% chance to reduce your active cooldowns by 1 second. Continuing with survivability, you will have access to Blood Mist, which is your oh shit button, making you immune to all damage and unstoppable to all crowd control for 3 seconds, saving you from potential certain death. Blood Mist also deals a small amount of damage to surrounding enemies, but more importantly, you heal 0.5% of your maximum health every second, adding that little bit more to your tankiness. Lastly, with the abilities, we have Bone Storm, which is both an offensive and defensive ability thanks to a couple legendary powers, but more on that later. Essentially, Bone Storm is a swirling barrier around your character, dealing damage per second to anything that is inside its radius over 10 seconds, as well as increasing your damage reduction by 15% while it's active. Gearing I found pretty simple throughout my journey to 100, even going as far as obtaining all best in slot uniques before ever hitting 100, 2 of which I have already mentioned, those being Ebon Piercer and Ring of the Sacrilegious Soul. and in my opinion they are the most important ones because they enable some pretty crucial aspects of the build, such as automatic skill casting and 5 times more projectiles being shot from your main ability. The last unique is a one-handed scythe called the Black River, which allows corpse explosion to consume up to 4 more corpses around the initial corpse, dealing up to 130% more damage and up to a 25% larger radius per additional corpse. The Black River will make clearing quicker and will also help you solve some essence issues that this build suffers from. Blight is quite essence hungry, and one of the best ways to get your essence back is by consuming corpses via corpse explosion. So the Black River will essentially allow you to gain back up to 5 times more essence because it consumes up to 5 corpses at once. Other notable uniques that can be used within this build but are not required are the Lidless Wall, a great option for early game survivability, and Greaves of the Empty Tomb offer extra lucky hit chance and damage reduction. Now, if you're lucky enough to find any of the following Uber uniques, they are also extremely viable, if not better, considering they are Uber uniques, the most powerful items in the game. First off, Harlequin Crest increases the rank of all of your abilities by 4 and reduces the damage taken by 20%. Ring of the Starless Skies reduces the resource cost of your skills and increases your damage by up to 40% for 3 seconds. And lastly, Doombringer, an incredibly strong option for tankiness, but you will lose overall damage. As for your other pieces of legendary gear, you're going to want to prioritize these stats. That is a lot of stats though, and a lot of them are self-explanatory, so I will quickly cover some niche but very important ones, such as essence per second and resource cost reduction, because as I've mentioned previously, this build turns out to be quite essence hungry, and it's not fun playing any build when you're constantly out of your resource, unable to cast any abilities, so prioritize that. And it's important to note that when you're fighting bosses, the majority of your damage will come from when they are in their down state, because in that state they are completely crowd controlled, and you will deal a ton more damage to enemies that are crowd controlled. So make sure you invest into more damage to crowd controlled enemies, and invest into lucky hit chance and lucky hit chance to crowd control enemies, because that will result in more damage to normal enemies when you're clearing pits or dungeons. Lastly, in the last week or so, there was a new mechanic that was found for the stat damage, where now we know that it basically is double the value that is shown on a piece of gear for damage over time abilities, such as Blight or Corpse Explosion. Therefore, it now slightly outperforms shadow damage over time, but don't worry too much if you have already min-maxed your gear for shadow damage over time, since this is just as strong as it was before. It's just that now we know that damage is just a little bit better to stack, but you still want to stack both of them at once. This is the main reason why the other build variant has recently become more popular, because it deals more damage utilizing a two-handed scythe and stacking as much damage as possible on all gear. The gems that you want to socket into your gear are Ruby in your armor for maximum life, or Topaz for intelligence stacking, Amethyst in your weapons for shadow damage over time, and Diamond or Skull in your jewelry to cap either resistances or armor. As for legendary powers, I will briefly touch on them. Void, your blight defiled areas pull in surrounding enemies. Blighted, you deal up to 120% increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. Damned, you deal up to 50% increased damage to cursed enemies. Retribution, you deal up to 30% increased damage to stunned or knocked down enemies. Ultimate Shadow, Bone Storm is now a darkness skill, making enemies damaged by Bone Storm take shadow damage over time for 2 seconds. Shielding Storm, each time Bone Storm damages an enemy, gain a barrier equal up to 6% of your maximum life for 10 seconds. Hardened Bones, you have up to 25% damage reduction. And Slaughter, you gain 20% increased movement speed, losing it upon taking damage. I will not go through the entire skill tree as that would take too long, however here is an image of the entire skill tree. And that about sums up the entire build very briefly. Of course there is a ton more to talk about, but I just don't feel experienced enough to give you guys that knowledge just yet. This build entirely is taken from Maxwell, and I will link it in the description below if you are interested. There you will also find much more in-depth information about this build, and another video by a creator called Marco Boy, which goes in depth about the endgame bossing variant, which deals potentially double the damage of the all-rounder variant I talked about in this video. Now you might be asking, if there's another version of this build that just seems better, then why wouldn't I cover it instead? Well, that's mainly because I haven't done it myself and I don't really want to be talking about something I haven't even done. And secondly, because this new bossing variant relies on the new damage stat tech, which I wasn't even aware of until a couple days ago, and since the first variant is still completely viable and is what I have personally done, I thought I would make a video about it. I've been having a lot of fun in Diablo 4 for the first time since the release of the game, and I wanted to make a video about anything within this game, so I thought I would start off with my first real endgame build and my first ever level 100 character. With all that being said, I might make a part 2 of this video covering the even better bossing variant if I ever get there, and if I don't, well, expect more Diablo 4 videos covering other builds and potentially other parts of the game. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video, I really appreciate it. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, night or day, and I'll see you around.